joined us. And there we go, it's being recorded. So hello everyone, my name is Effie Papargyropoulou. I'm an associate professor in sustainable food networks at the University of Leeds and a colleague of Dr Carrie Bradshaw, today's speaker. I'm an environmental and social scientist interested in sustainability and food security in the food systems. And I'm also an associate director of the urban food theme at the Global Food and Environment Institute, GFEI, who we bring this series of webinars to you today. I'm also the program lead of our interdisciplinary MSc in Sustainable Food Systems, which a lot of us contribute to. But enough about me. Today is about a brilliant presentation that we have today, and it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Carrie Bradshaw, who's a lecturer in law in our School of Law here at the University of Leeds. So Carrie joined Leeds in 2018, and before that she was a lecturer in law at the University of York, and before that she was a teaching fellow at the University College London. In her current research, she examines food waste as a distinct legal and policy problem. And as part of this work, she is an ESRC Parliamentary Academic Fellow working with the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, some of you might know that as POST, to support scrutiny of interventions to prevent food waste. So a little bit about the Global Food and Environment Institute, GFEI, for those of you that might not know of us. So we are in an interdisciplinary research community that brings together members across academia, industry, public policy to work on the integrated challenges of food security and climate change. You can learn a lot more about what we do on our website. And this seminar is part of the series of seminars that we bring to our members and anybody else who's interested in it. And you can see future events advertised on Ticket Source, so please visit those for any future events. So also, just before I introduce to you Carrie, just to remind you of the seminar etiquette. So please ensure that your cameras and microphones are off. We're going to have 20 minutes presentation by Carrie, followed by 10 minutes of Q&A. Any questions you might have, please post them onto the chat function, and I will collate that and lead the Q&A at the end. So before I hand over to Carrie, just to say that this is really timely. It's Food Waste Week, so we are all really interested in hearing what Carrie has to say, even more so this week. So I'll stop talking now and I'll hand over to Carrie for her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Effie. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I'm very pleased to be here today. I'm going to talk about food waste law and policy. In 2018, government set out a new, ambitious and broadly welcomed legislative strategy to preventing food waste in England. Fast forward to the present day, 2024, with that proposed legislation starting to now take shape. What I'm going to talk about today is, I think, the potential missed opportunities that government is failing to grasp to tackle food waste across the supply chain. And the main headline of my talk today is my concern that farm-level food waste in particular, greater in quantities than previously thought, is both excluded from and overlooked within the main regulatory frameworks in place. So the ones that are already in place and the legislation that we expect maybe quite soon. And this in turn could undermine existing regulatory frameworks, prevent or hamper action against farm-level food waste in the future, and may even incentivize greater levels of food waste on farms. So I have some concerns that I'll be flagging today. So the starting point is the Resources and Waste Strategy published in 2018, which contains an entire chapter on food waste. This is basically still where our food waste policy lives. As I've explained in my published work on that strategy, it did mark a significant policy shift in food waste that was broadly welcome. Particularly what was good about the strategy was a food waste specific approach, as opposed to treating food waste as sort of similar to or like other waste problems. And notably, the policy outlines government promises to consult on its new legislative approach to food waste, legislation that would complement the existing voluntary measures in place in the UK and in England. And indeed, the strategy confirmed the centrality of the UK's largely voluntary approach to preventing food waste. So even with forthcoming legislation that I'll talk to you about, voluntary measures are still the kind of main game in town. And as I can tell from some of the people on the call, many of you will know that this is centred around the Courtauld commitments, which have set out progressive, non-binding food waste reduction targets that have been dating back since 2005. And the Courtauld commitments, that voluntary agreement, is also complemented by the Food Waste Reduction Roadmap, under which all food businesses in the UK are encouraged to measure and publicly report on targeted actions to reduce food waste. As I outline in my forthcoming report for Parliament that Effie mentioned in the introduction, there's a limited evidence base evaluating the effectiveness of the UK's voluntary approach to food waste. There is some evidence of positive outcomes, but reductions achieved prior to 2018 could have been due to population changes and rising food prices. And the Waste and Resources Action Programme, or WRAP, has also recently reported that there was an increase in levels of food waste in the UK since 2018. The Courtauld commitments, like that voluntary agreement, has also been criticised for its limited participation, a lack of transparency, and both of those problems are known generally in the literature to undermine the cost effectiveness of voluntary measures when compared with a more binding regulatory approach. And while there remains a counterfactual of would progress have been faster if we'd adopted a direct regulatory approach, we don't really know the answer to that question, but a macroeconomic study found that non-legally binding initiatives appear to have had no significant impact on food waste. So there's question marks about the voluntary approach. Undoubtedly some progress, but that progress limited, and the evidence to demonstrate that also limited. For the purposes of today's talk, and what I want to focus on today, it's important to note that the Courtauld food waste prevention targets only apply to the post-farm gate supply chain. They do not cover food waste on farms. Now, the lack of robust data on farm level food waste does make it difficult to set a baseline for targets. So consistent measurement is routinely highlighted as a key priority. And there is widespread support for mandatory food waste reporting in academic studies, as well as amongst NGOs, campaigners, and indeed businesses and retailers. And I think I've spotted someone on the call who's been spearheading campaigns for mandatory food waste reporting in the press this week. One of the government's proposals in the Resources and Waste Strategy was to consult on a mandatory food waste reporting obligation for certain businesses as part of government's new legislative approach. And since then, we've had a bit of back and forth on mandatory reporting. So after government consultation revealed overwhelming support from its consultation respondents for the idea of requiring businesses to report on food waste, government then decided that it wouldn't proceed with its plans. And this prompted an NGO to begin litigation against that decision, basically to argue that the government had been irrational and ignored its own evidence base in refusing to go ahead with mandatory reporting, after which eventually government reported towards the end of last year that it would, somewhat vaguely, it would reconsider whether there should be mandatory reporting in the future. So a bit of back and forth there. And as I explain in a bit more detail in a forthcoming publication, this sort of toing and froing and delay probably undermines the already limited voluntary approach to food waste upon which the UK relies, because often a success factor in voluntary approaches is a meaningful legislative threat operating in the background. This back and forth has also revealed at times a disregard on the part of government for its own evidence base, and I think is potentially symptomatic of a more fundamental resistance to the value of external expertise and open-minded consultation. And that fundamental resistance has been identified more generally in the environmental legal scholarships, and questions about the consultation approach at DEFRA have been made in the specialist media. You can see from the slide there a couple of articles in the ENDS report. Coming back to the ideas that I started with at the beginning around where does farm level food waste fit in this picture, a potential problem with the current proposal for mandatory food waste reporting, which may be implemented in the future, is that it doesn't apply to food wasted on farms. Now, measuring food waste on farms is challenging, and smaller farmers would certainly need support, but there is evidence to suggest that the costs of measurement to farmers would outweigh the potential savings of doing so. And I'm also concerned that excluding food wasted on farms from the reporting obligations also creates a kind of chicken and egg scenario around future action. So it's often suggested that we can't set food waste prevention targets for farms, be that binding or non-binding, without having a robust baseline to do so. But of course, consistent measurement and reporting is necessary to provide that baseline. And without mandatory reporting, that could be particularly difficult. So a potential missed opportunity there, I think. What I'm particularly concerned about is that excluding food waste on farms from these obligations to measure and report could lead to greater levels of food wasted on farms. So food waste arises on farms for a variety of reasons that I can't go into in detail today. There's a couple of reports there on the slide that are a good start. But part of the story here is the practices of more powerful actors in the supply chain, particularly retailers. Farmers are often described as price and term takers, vulnerable to contractual and other so-called unfair trading practices, many of which you'll see in the reports on the slide are associated with food waste on farms and overproduction. A good example is practices around aesthetic or cosmetic requirements. So these include legally prescribed marketing standards, but there are also often more exacting private cosmetic standards that are imposed by buyers, particularly retailers, that often require fruit and veg to look a certain way, and this in turn can lead to food waste. And as I said, those standards are sometimes more exacting than the ones we find in law. And sometimes these private standards are applied inconsistently by retailers, in essence, to manage and balance supply and demand. So sometimes aesthetic requirements are loosened when consumer demand is high and tightened when consumer demand is low. Now, the report on the left there does highlight the need for more research here, but there is some evidence that farmers produce more than they need to avoid contractual penalties and other unfair commercial retaliation from more powerful actors in the supply chain, in case that they're not able to produce and meet orders of a certain spec delivered in full on time. So a complex situation there across the supply chain that drives food waste on farms. And if we bring this back to the regulation, if farm level food waste is beyond the reach both of the non-binding quartile targets and hidden from public view under the mandatory reporting obligation, then it creates an additional incentive for retailers and other buyers whose own food waste would be covered by those regulatory obligations to reject surplus food and or return it to farms. So in short, the reporting obligation as currently proposed, but yet to be implemented, has the potential, I think, to make the food waste situation on farms worse. So all of this places greater reliance on those regulations in place to try and deal with those unfair trading practices that cause farm level food waste. And let's talk now about what government's doing about this. What are these regulations? So I'm going to give a health warning to start with. This is complicated, and it's about to get more complicated with new regulations expected to come into force this year. Now, as you can see from the diagram, we already have something called the Groceries Supply Code of Practice. And this imposes a range of binding obligations on designated retailers, these are the biggest supermarkets and others, to deal fairly with their direct suppliers. And these direct suppliers are, for the most part, food manufacturers or processors. And since around 2013, these binding obligations on retailers have been enforced by the Grocery Code Adjudicator. Now, I should make really clear, this regime was not implemented with the prevention of food waste in mind. But given that it addresses some of those unfair trading practices that evidence suggests do cause food waste in the supply chain, there are some within the food waste community who view this regulation as having the potential to reduce food waste. I confess I do not share that optimism for reasons I discuss in a forthcoming paper, but I'm not going to get into that today. What I want to think about more is what this means for food waste on farms. And the most obvious limitation of this regime is that most farmers do not supply designated retailers directly. And so most of them are not protected by this regime. So again, farm level food waste is excluded from the regulation in play here. But in GSCOP's defense, it was never designed or intended to prevent food waste. It's always tangential to its aims. The same cannot be said of a new regime under the UK's landmark Agriculture Act, which you'll now look, if you look on the slide, has appeared at the bottom there. Unlike the Groceries Code, Supply Code of Practice, the agriculture regime is, or at least was at one point, and we'll come back to that, an explicit part of government policy on food waste. So the food waste chapter that I put up on as my first slide, right at the beginning of the presentation, described this new regime at the bottom there as being sought to protect producers from unfair trading practices, which often cause food waste on farms. So basically what the Act does is it creates new powers for government to introduce regulation that sort of plugs the gap in protection and to regulate the contracts basically between farmers and manufacturers. Now, I and others have already raised concerns about these two regimes with two different regulators owned by two government departments coexisting. There's strong calls now just to extend the GSCOP regime across the entire chain. In my published research, I flagged the concern that retailers will effectively slip through the net of regulation that, unlike GSCOP, was adopted with farm level food waste in mind. Another concern that I outline in forthcoming work is that we are beginning to see new intermediary organisations created and inserted within this supply chain with the simple purpose of evading both of these regimes. And that in turn would undermine any effectiveness of the new regulation in tackling food waste. So we've got a very fragmented approach here that raises challenges for tackling those practices that cause food waste on farms. It's really important to note that at the moment, the Agriculture Act regime at the bottom of this diagram is not yet in force. This hasn't been implemented yet. government has undertaken consultations on using its powers to introduce new regulation in some sectors of the supply chain. And recently, we also have some draft regulations covering just milk contracts. And the big concern I have going forward is that in those consultations, the food waste potential of these powers appears to have just been overlooked. So the new milk regulations, I think, do contain provisions that could be helpful in reducing food waste on farms, but none of the government consultations made any reference or explicitly invited evidence on how these new regulations might be used to reduce food waste. And this is another missed opportunity. There's a limited evidence base as to what type of contractual terms and practices might help reduce food waste on farms, and that evidence base could have been enhanced and made jurisdiction specific by gathering evidence from UK farmers. It also seems a missed opportunity to not think about how these regulations interact with the plans for mandatory reporting. I'm concerned that if farm level food waste is excluded from the mandatory reporting obligations, then this could actually exacerbate the unfair trading practices driving that waste and the practices that this new regime seeks to address, essentially by hiding a known side effect of them. So there's a real risk that government's twin policy objectives of improving fairness in the supply chain for farmers and reducing food waste on farms could be undermined if the mandatory food waste reporting proposal goes ahead in its current form. In forthcoming publications, I consider some of the potential reasons for overlooking the food waste opportunities here. They include potentially a lack of joined up thinking across DEFRA, so maybe food waste and agriculture teams not integrated properly. There's ongoing questions about a potential lack of resource at DEFRA, all of which may be symptomatic of the now widely acknowledged government failures to prioritise prevention, as highlighted by the National Audit Committee and the House of Commons Committee on Public Accounts. Since the Resources and Waste Strategy, we've also had 6 Secretaries of State in charge at DEFRA in as many years. And ultimately, I think the legislative aspects of food waste policy, mandatory reporting, the new supply chain regulation, I think the priorities have, with that shifting leadership, meant that food waste legislation has, as a policy idea, has fallen into and then maybe partially out of abeyance. And I think there are genuinely some reasonable questions to ask whether an interest in the evidence base and improving it through wide and open consultation has similarly waxed and waned with that changing leadership. So I think I'm probably coming to my 20 minutes now. Despite the promise of the Resources and Waste Strategy, and all the optimism that surrounded that food waste policy in 2018, I'm worried that the expected legislative interventions in this area flowing from that policy are representing a missed opportunity to reduce food waste on the supply chain, particularly on farms, and could potentially even make things worse. Thank you very much for listening. Here is a slide setting out the research that underpins today's presentation, and I think Effie is now going to administer the Q&A.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Carrie. What insightful and thought-provoking. And I want to say positive, but unfortunately, there's a lot of hurdles and barriers, and it's a very complex picture. And it's I'm really grateful unpicking the different measures that are being placed in there that either are specifically targeting food waste or relate to food waste, and how they all mix together is quite fascinating and quite mind-boggling as well. So just to go back to your the title of your presentation that I forgot to even introduce when I introduced you. So it was Food Waste Law and Policy, Fit for Purpose, with a little question mark. So I guess the answer to that question that we were all reflecting on is probably no. It's not quite fit for purpose.
It's not too late to grasp these legislative opportunities. So government has new powers, government has mandatory reporting on its radar. It's all about not dropping the ball with these rare legislative moments now. So I'm optimistic, but I have question marks, as you say.
Yeah, no, that's a very fair point, and I like the optimism. So, questions are coming in, so I invite everybody that has questions to post them on the chat with the chat function. I had a few sort of reflections, I guess, on the broader things of surrounding this type of work. So there is a mix of voluntary versus legislative. So the carrot and stick situation, and at the moment we have a little bit of voluntary and quite a reluctant, move to push for more, things that people have to do, organizations will have to get on with. So from examples from, I guess, elsewhere as well, what are some a good mix of those two, because I think we need both, and one doesn't fit all, and there's no perfect picture. But what would be a good balance? I want to ask, according to your research, to strike there in order to have a better, food waste prevention.
I think the legislative measures that government proposed in that strategy are, most of them, broadly speaking, a good idea. I think a mandatory food waste reduction target would be a really good idea. The EU has gone for that. I'm supportive of the two bits of legislation I talked about today. I think there's questions about the proper implementation of that. And trying to ensure that it tackles the whole food supply chain. That's the real message here. We need measures that run from farm to fork. And as soon as you start chopping off apart the supply chain from the reach of those legislative measures, you create incentives to hide it there. So I thought the resources and waste strategy was in many ways welcome. I'm worried that we are creating problems in the future by taking a sort of segmented approach to the supply chain as we are with mandatory reporting and these new unfairness regulations.
Thank you. Thank you for that response. And I'm keeping an eye on the questions. And every time there's a new comment, the questions pop up, so in a different place. So I'm going to start with the question from Judy Ford. Thank you very much, Judy. Do you know what the prospects are for allowing farm food waste to be used as animal feed in England?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Judith. The best people to speak to about this are probably feedback and their work on the pig idea. I do have a small section of it in the forthcoming post brief that suggests that there's a good amount of confidence amongst experts that we can do that safely, but the political appetite around and the concerns around safety are probably what holds us back. So I think I'm supportive of considering that, but I suspect the politics aren't there, Judith.
Yes, and linked to that, there is a question from Pazit. So is there room to broaden the voluntary approach by using the wasted food in the farm to become a food source for animal farm, as an example, maybe by litigation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be a good start to more robustly extend the voluntary approach to farms. There is an expectation that businesses will act in this area, and it's not like we're not doing anything through voluntary measures on farms. But I think not having a target from farm to fork is a problem, and not robustly measuring it means we can't get that target. So that was that chicken and egg scenario I was talking about. Yes, I think there is more space for using surplus on farms, and that was the idea behind a lot of the measures in the resources and waste strategy, that we should make it easier for farmers to utilise surplus. The question mark I have, and Effie's work touches on this as well, is whether actually we should be trying to reduce that surplus in the first place, or reducing surplus as a certain types of food and in certain places. In terms of Litigation, I don't know. I'm not entirely sure what specific aspect there you want to litigate, but certainly NGOs are turning to litigation increasingly now in order to try and force government into action. So the mandatory reporting litigation is a really good example, and often that litigation uses the advice, for example, of the Committee on Climate Change and other scientific evidence to make it very clear to government where it's failing to meet its own obligations around things like climate change and waste.
Yeah, thank you, Carrie. And it is a balance, because again, that whole supply chain, unless we take that approach, we're just pushing the problem in a different place. And as you said, rightly so, it could be in places where it's not as seen, which is even worse. So I'll just move now slightly to a couple of questions from, oh, it moved again, do you mean, on monitoring and reporting. So Adam and Chloe have some questions on that. Thank you both. So Adam's question is, how feasible would it be for a farmer with a business large enough to be working with a retailer to measure the waste as part of a mandatory reporting scheme? Perceptions of a burden is likely contributing to that lack for support amongst the farmers and the NFU for mandatory reporting being extended to primary production. So I'll start with that, and then I'll follow up with Chloe's that is quite linked to that. Thank you.
Sure. Hi, Adam. Thanks for your question. Yes, you're absolutely right. So there was some very good investigative journalism that revealed that it was probably the NFU behind the decision not to proceed, which was curious given farmers weren't covered by it anyway. But I think that there is reasonable questions around how we distribute the burdens for food waste measurement and food waste reduction. And certainly something that my PhD student found in the field was that when suppliers identified food waste reductions and reported those to retailers, retailers would ask for a price reduction because they'd say, that's an efficiency gain, we want a price reduction for that. So the NFU is right, I think, that there are concerns about what happens to the costs and benefits of food waste prevention and food waste measurement. I think there's ways around that, and it's always about transparency. I think transparency is better than hiding it. I think another thing, and I pushed for this in the mandatory consultation, and I think, Adam, you know I pushed for this probably, if it's the Adam, I think it is, was that actually we should place the burden for reporting on retailers. We should require retailers to report food waste in their supply chain. So it should be a reporting obligation that stretches beyond their own organisation. And in doing so, add a narrative reporting obligation that requires retailers to explain how they prevented food waste, who bore the costs of that, and how the benefits of it were shared across the food supply chain. But yes, I think it is feasible for farmers to work with retailers, and that's the model under the voluntary approach with whole chain reduction plans, actually, that you join the supply chain up. So I would like to see supply chain reporting, and I'd like to see retailers take the lead on that.
Lovely, thank you, Carrie. And linked to that, a close comment is about whether you think that on-farm measurement and data will result in discourses of blaming the farmer for the food loss and waste problem, and how could this possibly be avoided?
Yeah, thank you, Chloe. It's an excellent question, and it's one of the concerns I share for the reasons I already said about retailers potentially coming after farmers for the cost benefits of food waste reduction, and also this challenge. I think that there will be concerns. I mean, every time we look at food waste on farms, we find that there's more. And of course, it's not farmers, for the reasons in the research that I cited, it's actually not farmers who are often to blame for this. I think, so Chloe, I totally agree, that is a concern. One of the things that I think should be explored, as I said in the response to Adam's question, is supply chain reporting. So requiring retailers to report on food waste in their supply chain and have a narrative reporting obligation that contextualizes that. This type of supply chain reporting is actually increasingly common now in other contexts. We have other examples of companies being required to account for what happens in their supply chain. So there's experience that we can have from other contexts. And I think if we put the burden on retailers, they're the ones with power to shift change. They're the ones with the ability to see what happens in their supply chain. I think if we place this supply chain reporting on retailers, we may be able to deal to some extent with that discourse of blaming farmers. I think generally people tend to blame retailers more than farmers anyway. So I suspect farmers are maybe a little bit insulated, but Chloe, I share the concern.
Yeah, thank you, Carrie. I don't know. I think farmers get a lot of blame for a lot of different things. So yeah, it's definitely a big concern. And something related to that, a comment from Marcus. So Marcus says, I suppose there's always going to be food waste, and the ways to use it. For example, anaerobic digestion is one option there. However, by hiding the amount through the holes in the reporting, how can investment decisions be made? So this brings out a really big issue, really highlighting the outcome of your research that suggests we really need to be transparent. So I'll let you answer that, but very good question. Thank you.
I mean, yeah, Effie, you answered it, and I hadn't thought about that, Marcus, but it's a good point, and it's important to know. And I pushed for this actually in my response to the consultation about the importance of measuring and reporting waste and surplus, and government had suggested that it would do that. And that presumably would be useful to the anaerobic digestion industry. I don't know what the AD industry did in response to the consultation. I should probably do some digging around that, but I agree, Marcus. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, but also actors in the area need the information in order to plan for future investment. And this is a long-term game that we're trying to solve here.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Carrie. So I think we're going to wrap things up and come to a close. I would like, first of all, to thank you, Carrie, for such an insightful presentation and the discussions that follow, everyone that participated, and the really interesting and spot-on comments and questions from the chat. Just to remind everybody that this has been recorded and it will be on the YouTube channel. So please follow the links that very kindly Sarah and others have posted on the chat to follow up, and you can watch it again. So with that, thank you very much, Carrie. Thank you, everyone, and have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.